Thanks to Linode Cloud Computing for supporting this episode of SciShow. Head to linode.com/SciShow to learn more and get a $100 60-day credit on a new Linode account. Carbon dioxide is a fact of our lives. You're breathing it out every time you exhale. And at larger scales, that carbon dioxide is the biggest player in the climate crisis, reshaping our world in an urgent way. But that's not the only way carbon dioxide has changed the world. It's also contributed to making some of the weirdest places on Earth. For starters, it's one of the weirdest things about an already weird lava lake in Antarctica.
Earth is covered in lakes. Mostly these are cool, watery affairs full of life, a great place for a relaxing vacation. Lava lakes are a little less serene. They're scorching, seething pools of molten rock. They're also pretty rare outside of Minecraft. Permanent lava only exists in a few places around the globe. One of the strangest lava lakes is atop Mount Erebus on the frozen continent of Antarctica. Probably the weirdest thing about this lake is that it's constantly releasing gas, and the composition of that gas changes on a roughly 10-minute cycle. Erebus was a Greek god, the son of chaos, which is kind of fitting for a place made of ice and fire. Mount Erebus is the tallest peak on Ross Island, which lies close to the Antarctic mainland and is usually connected by ice sheets. It's an active volcano that's been bubbling away for decades, occasionally throwing off larger eruptions. The lava lake is around 20 meters deep, and it sits in a crater which is itself inside of Mount Erebus's main crater. Under that lake is a conduit, a tube that leads down to a chamber full of magma, underground lava, in other words. So the lake is basically like a bowl with a hole in the bottom sitting on top of a pipe. Like a sink, I guess you could say, except it goes the other way. It doesn't go down, it goes up. And all of it's about 1,000 degrees Celsius. Even in the frigid Antarctic air, the lake's surface won't cool into solid rock, thanks to the convection currents that feed the lake with a steady supply of hot stuff. Hot magma rises to the top of the lake, then spreads outward, cooling off along the way. As it cools, it gets denser, so it sinks back down again, and the convection cycle continues. Lava lakes need that crater, conduit, and magma chamber combo to exist, and not many volcanoes have all of those components so well aligned. That's why molten lava lakes are super rare. There are only about 5 on Earth that have remained persistently active in recent years. So the Mount Erebus lava lake is an unusual and remote place, but thanks to some intrepid scientists, it's an area of active research. Scientists have braved freezing slopes and burning lava bombs, that's the technical term for flying blobs of lava, and they've installed remote sensors to keep tabs on the lake 24/7. One mystery they're working on is the lake's persistent gas emissions. For years, Erebus has been steadily releasing a gas plume, and there's a weird cycle to it. Over the course of 10 minutes or so, there's a repetitive shift in both the amount of gas produced and its composition, the overall mix. For example, the carbon dioxide to carbon monoxide ratio changes, as do emission levels of water vapor and sulfur dioxide. Researchers have been trying to figure out why there's this repeating cycle, and based on sensor data and computer modeling, they think it has to do with 2 main sources of gas. One comes from the conduit, and the other comes from diffusion in the lake. The carbon dioxide-rich gas is always rising up from the conduit, and it's basically constant. The amount and composition doesn't really change. But the conduit also occasionally, like every 10 minutes or so, burps out a large blob of magma from deeper in the chamber, like a kind of literal one-way lava lamp. Once a blob gets near the surface of the lake, it releases a fresh set of gases, which adds to the total amount of gas detected and changes the overall composition because it's rich in water vapor and sulfur dioxide. In addition to these shorter cycles, the lava lake also has what researchers call explosive degassing. These less frequent but more impressive belches cause small eruptions, hurling lava bombs into the main crater. The 2 systems seem to work independently. The composition of gas from the explosive degassing is different from the gas from the shorter cycle and appears to come from much deeper in the volcano's magma chamber. There is still a lot left to learn about Erebus and lava lakes in general. For example, there are gas cycles with other cycle lengths that aren't as well studied. Working out if they're connected and how will build up a better model of the inner workings of Mount Erebus. Mount Erebus also contains a rare type of magma called phonolite. It's much thicker than the more common basalt variety, which probably affects the fluid dynamics inside the magma chamber and lake. So hopefully the recent studies on Erebus will be useful for scientists working on other lava lakes around the world. These lakes may be rare, but having good models from the few examples around the world will help geologists understand the similarities and differences between them and the overall rules about how they work.
I think we can all agree that one of the hottest things on Earth and one of the coldest places on Earth, with an inexplicably regular schedule, is pretty weird. But lava lakes aren't the only weird lakes that carbon dioxide has contributed to. Carbon dioxide and volcanoes team up again to make exploding lakes.
In the evening of August 21st, 1986, 80 million cubic meters of carbon dioxide gas suddenly erupted from Lake Nyos in the West African country of Cameroon. This massive cloud expanded at 50 kilometers an hour, suffocating everything within a 25-kilometer radius, killing more than 1,700 people. The only known similar event happened at nearby Lake Manoon 2 years earlier, where 37 people died. And scientists weren't really sure at first what was going on. They figured these were some kind of volcanic eruptions because both lakes are close to Cameroon's Oku volcanic field, which includes 4 major volcanoes. But even though volcanoes were partly to blame for these explosions, it turns out that they were no volcanic eruptions. Instead, what made these lakes explode were limnic eruptions, which are like popping open the largest, most pressurized soda can of all time. The volcanoes near the lakes are a sign that there's magma or molten rock close beneath the surface. And magma releases huge volumes of carbon dioxide, which can filter up through the crust of the earth into the bottoms of the lakes. Now, these lake bottoms are highly pressurized and very cold, which is exactly what gases need in order to dissolve in water. So lots of carbon dioxide can dissolve in the lakes and just build up, sitting there. But as the CO2 continues to build, those lakes get to be like cans of soda pumped up with way too much fizz. Most lakes don't explode, thankfully, even if they're sitting on top of a whole lot of magma. That's because the water gets mixed around when the temperature changes throughout the year. In the fall and spring, the changing surface temperature affects the water's density and keeps it circulating, and in turn helps release the gas. But in Lake Nyos and Lake Manoon, things are very different. It's hot pretty much all the time, so the shallower, less dense water stays at the top of the lake, where the gas-infused deeper layers stay below. As a result, tens of millions of cubic meters of carbon dioxide can accumulate. No one's sure what exactly triggered Cameroon's limnic eruptions, but a seemingly minor event that another lake might not even notice, like a heavy rainfall or a landslide or a small earthquake, could send some of that gas-rich deep water up into the shallows. In which case, it's like poking a hole in that overpumped soda can and suddenly everything is covered in liquid and fizz. Except that instead of getting a little sticky, the liquid is a 25-meter wave of water and the fizz is a giant deadly cloud of carbon dioxide. For obvious reasons, no one wants this to happen again, so once scientists figured out what was going on, pipes were installed in the depths of Lake Nyos and Lake Manoon, allowing the carbon dioxide to escape before enough of it built up to cause another explosion. Now, though, there's concern about a third lake, Kivu, on the border of Rwanda in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It also has a lot of gas buildup, and the sediment at the bottom of the lake contains evidence of sudden lake-wide extinctions every few thousand years, probably because of limnic eruptions. Lake Kivu is extra dangerous, though, because it also contains enormous amounts of methane produced by bacteria that ingest the carbon dioxide. If that lake explodes, there could be both fiery explosions and widespread suffocation, and there are 2 million people living on the shores of Lake Kivu. So in 2011, plans were put into place to start siphoning off some of that methane and using it to generate electricity for Rwanda. The hope is that we can harness the terrifying power of limnic explosions before they can occur, maybe even put it to good use.
So this particular weird carbon dioxide-filled place probably isn't the best spot for a vacation, but it sounds like folks have already identified the silver lining in learning how to make it less deadly. In that way, it's kind of the opposite of this next weird carbon dioxide-filled place, because it's so isolated that CO2 is the secret to staying alive. But first, let's take a detour from carbon-filled clouds to the digital cloud. This video is supported by Linode Cloud Computing. For you small business tycoons and future tycoons, Linode can help you truly own your site and your online business. By building your business on Linode, all of the commission from every sale and subscription goes to you, because their open source tools don't take a cut of your business's sales. Plus, with Linode, you can quickly back up your entire website and even move it to a new platform if you need to. Linode's thorough FAQ docs and video tutorials are available to walk you through the entire process. And if you ever get stuck, 24/7 support is just a click or phone call away. To get started, click the link in the description or head to linode.com/SciShow. That link gives you a $100 60-day credit on a new Linode account. Thanks to Linode for sponsoring this episode. Now, on to the next video about one of the most isolated places we've ever found living things.
Weird stuff happens in caves. Venture into the darkness and you never know what you might find. Glowworms, crystals, millions of sleeping bats, a horcrux, Grendel's mom. In 1986, a prospecting crew in southern Romania was looking for a good place to build a geothermal power plant when they accidentally discovered one of the oddest caves of all. It's called Movila Cave, and it's basically a time capsule, crawling with strange life that has lived separate from the rest of Earth for millions of years. More than 20 meters underground, the cave is pitch dark, warm, and full of toxic gases, and holds a lake that reeks of burnt rubber and rotten eggs. And other than the prospecting shaft, the cave is totally sealed up in all directions. You heard me right, it's been cut off from the rest of the world for about 5.5 million years, making it one of the most isolated places on Earth. Thanks to the thick layers of clay above the cave, nothing seeps down from the Earth's surface, no sunlight, no food, and no water. There aren't even any traces of radioactive metals from the Chernobyl nuclear accident, which are spread throughout the soils and lakes near the cave. But there are all sorts of hardcore creepy crawlies down there, and they've formed a complex ecosystem. Movila's lake water is covered by a tissue paper-like mat made up of billions of autotrophic bacteria, which can turn inorganic compounds like carbon dioxide along with some energy into food. And the air in the cave has about 100 times more carbon dioxide than outside air, which provides them all the CO2 they need. Here on Earth's surface, lots of organisms, like plants, use light and carbon dioxide to make food. That's photosynthesis. But these bacteria cannot use photosynthesis. They live in total darkness, so they don't have access to sunlight or any light energy at all. So instead, they use chemosynthesis, or energy from chemical reactions involving the toxic gases in the cave, like hydrogen sulfide, to help generate their food. Other kinds of bacteria floating in the lake use methane gas as their only source of carbon and energy. Worms, shrimp, and other smaller organisms feast on all of these microbes, and then larger invertebrates like spiders and centipedes feed on them. Not only do these chemosynthetic bacteria support an entire ecosystem, but they also end up shaping the cave itself. Reactions involving hydrogen sulfide gas produce sulfuric acid, which erodes the limestone walls over time. That gradually makes the cave bigger and also releases more carbon dioxide gas. It's a pretty cool ecosystem, and the Movila Cave is the only place we know like this. At least on land. Deep down in the ocean, there are geothermal vents thick with the same types of toxic gases found in the cave. And there are similar chemosynthetic bacteria living around those vents. Both Movila Cave and the vents might resemble the dark and gassy conditions of the early days of planet Earth, which has left some scientists wondering if these Movila microbes might be similar to the first kinds of life. But even though similar bacteria have been found elsewhere, what about all those larger invertebrates? To be honest, they're a bunch of creepy-looking weirdos, but I guess living in total isolation and darkness for millions of years will do that to you. Scientists have discovered 48 species in the cave, 33 of which were previously unknown, including 3 spiders, a leech, a centipede, and a very unusual insect called a water scorpion that actually seems to be related to bed bugs. These organisms show the troglomorphic adaptations that are associated with life in the dark, like lack of skin pigmentation and extra-long antennae to help them feel around in the darkness. In fact, many are born without eyes at all, since they don't have much use for them. By now, though, you might be wondering how the heck these creatures got stuck underground in the first place. Well, we're not entirely sure. One hypothesis is that the changing climate at the end of the Miocene 5.5 million years ago may have had something to do with it. Colder, drier conditions on the Earth's surface could have sent surface invertebrates underground looking for shelter and warmth. And when the cave eventually sealed up, they were trapped. One of Movila's spiders is closely related to a surface species found 4,000 kilometers away in the Canary Islands, which may support this theory. Then again, it's also possible that some critters just fell in through cracks in the limestone more recently, like 2 million years ago instead of 5. Either way, it's a fascinating look at the strange ecosystems that can form in extreme places.
Now, the Movila Cave is a pretty isolated area, but this next place is on the opposite end of the spectrum. It's the most expansive area on Earth. Our oceans are full of dissolved carbon dioxide. That process is a crucial factor in the carbon cycle, but there's one very specific side effect you might not have thought about: supercharged lightning. Carbon dioxide isn't just a greenhouse gas, warming the planet by trapping heat in the atmosphere. According to the US National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, 1/3 of our estimated CO2 emissions end up in the ocean. This leads to ocean acidification, which is harmful to marine life. But ocean acidification might also trigger another phenomenon: stronger lightning strikes. Bet you didn't see that one coming. On the one hand, the ocean absorbing CO2 might seem like a good thing, because there's less of it in the atmosphere to warm the planet. But on the other hand, CO2 that dissolves in the ocean becomes carbonic acid, and the more CO2 the ocean absorbs, the more acidic the water becomes. This is bad news for corals and other shell-forming marine organisms, because they make their shells from minerals like calcium carbonate, which dissolve in acidic water. But that's not the only effect decreasing the pH of the ocean might have. We think of pH as a measure of acidity, and that's true, but on a molecular scale, pH is actually a measure of the concentration of hydrogen ions in a solution. The more hydrogen ions, the more acidic the solution is. In the case of CO2, the carbonic acid splits apart into positively charged hydrogen ions and negatively charged bicarbonate. The presence of these charged ions means the solution can also carry an electrical charge. A higher acidity, or lower number on the pH scale, means more hydrogen ions in the solution and more potential to conduct electricity. And that's a big deal, because the ocean is getting more acidic. Due to climate change, seawater has experienced a 0.1 unit drop in pH, which seems tiny, but the pH scale is logarithmic. A pH of 6 is 10 times more acidic than a pH of 7. So that change of 0.1 in the oceans corresponds to a 30% increase in acidity. So if climate change is potentially affecting the electrical conductivity of the ocean, could it affect lightning? This led a group of scientists to look into the idea, publishing 2 papers on the subject in 2020. Surprisingly, we don't know a lot about what happens when lightning hits the ocean, even less than we know about lightning strikes in general, because almost all lightning strikes happen on land. For something so big, covering nearly 2/3 of the Earth, oceans are only struck by about 10% of all the lightning that occurs. We used to assume that all surfaces act as perfect conductors, whether that surface is rocks, soil, or water. But while this assumption makes it easier to do calculations, it probably doesn't reflect reality perfectly. In fact, models show that when lightning does hit the ocean, it could be more intense than on land, probably because salt water is a better conductor. So, to test whether lightning could intensify as the ocean acidifies, the researchers carried out a simple experiment. They filled a beaker with seawater and placed 2 electrodes in the water about 2 centimeters apart. Then they ran power through the electrodes, forming sparks between them. Next, they changed the seawater's pH in 2 different ways. First, they added hydrochloric acid directly to the water. This is a good way to change the pH of the solution, but it doesn't reflect the real-world process of ocean acidification very well. Second, they decreased the pH by bubbling carbon dioxide into the water, which is pretty close to how ocean acidification actually works. And they found that as the water got more acidic, the spark's intensity did increase. The bubbling technique, which most closely replicates ocean acidification, made the spark twice as intense as the other method. That means ocean acidification could be making lightning stronger. In fact, the researchers claim that if ocean pH keeps decreasing according to the worst-case predictions, where CO2 emissions keep increasing unchecked, the intensity of ocean lightning strikes could increase by 30% by the end of this century. This is a definite concern for ships, oil rigs, and other ocean infrastructure. All of these structures already have some form of lightning protection, but if lightning does get more intense with climate change, these protections might need an upgrade. But it isn't just human-made structures that might be affected. Lightning strikes aren't just shocking, they're also loud. So if lightning strikes are getting stronger, animals that use sound to navigate, like whales and dolphins, might have a harder time. But maybe we shouldn't worry too much yet. Some researchers caution that while this study's method does what it's supposed to do, measuring a spark in a beaker of water might not be directly applicable to storms over the ocean. Lightning produces very large sparks, up to several hundred meters long. Sparks this big might behave very differently from small sparks generated in a controlled environment like a laboratory. Lightning is also 100 times more intense than the sparks these researchers produced, so comparing the two is a bit of a stretch. But these studies are laying the groundwork for future experiments, which hopefully will spark more research. Oceans have some of the weirdest stuff on Earth in general, but supercharged lightning takes them to a whole new level. Our last weird place made by carbon dioxide is also in the oceans, and that's the key to the weirdness, because these ferns aren't supposed to be in the ocean at all.
Let's talk about climate change, and I don't mean the kind that's happening right now. I mean the massive shift in climate that happened about 50 million years back when Earth went from toasty warm to ice age. And that huge change may have been mostly caused by a fern. Alright, so Earth was really hot 50 million years ago. I'm talking like total greenhouse planet, lots of CO2 in the air, palm trees and alligators living near the poles, that kind of hot. Then, something happened. The planet started to slowly cool, and all those poor gators had to relocate as the poles eventually formed ice caps, and the climate eventually shifted into cycles of 100,000-year ice ages with shorter breaks in between them. In 2004, an Arctic coring expedition started poking around the North Pole, looking for clues about what might have tipped the scales toward that global cooling so long ago. When they pulled up sediment core samples from under the Arctic Ocean, they found a series of sediment layers that reached back nearly 80 million years. And sure enough, the scientists noticed something unusual right around the 50 million year mark. A column of tiny fossilized ferns that was almost 10 meters deep. That was surprising. The ferns were a type of azolla, a genus of dime-sized, moss-like aquatic ferns that grow floating on the surface of water. Specifically, though, fresh water. But if these ferns grow in fresh water, what were they doing in the Arctic Ocean? Well, you gotta keep in mind that the Earth's geography was very different back then. The Arctic Ocean was essentially landlocked, and researchers think that runoff from rivers formed a layer of fresh water over the salt water, which made it a cozy, nutrient-rich environment that azolla ferns would have loved. Like, really loved. The little plant flourished for nearly 1 million years, erupting in blooms that covered millions of square kilometers. Eventually, though, shifting landmasses reopened a connection to other oceans, causing a deadly influx of salt water. That's when the azolla died and sank to the bottom of the ocean, forming the layers of sediment that we'd pull up millions of years later. But what does all that have to do with the Earth cooling down? Well, as you probably know, long-term climate cycles have a lot to do with the atmospheric tug-of-war between various gases. Extra carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases, for example, can trap heat and warm the planet. And azolla may have helped remove a lot of those gases in a few ways. First, there's the fern's relationship with a type of cyanobacteria called Anabina. The bacteria pass between ferns through their reproductive spores and live within their leaves. Anabina is great at taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and using it to provide the fern with fertilizer. This fertilizing process is so effective that under the right conditions, azolla can double its mass in just a couple of days. It also would have helped absorb lots and lots of nitrogen from the atmosphere. There's also the fact that azolla, like all photosynthesizing plants, is really good at eating up carbon dioxide. In fact, researchers estimate that over the course of those million years or so, azolla blooms might have gobbled up about half of all atmospheric CO2, reducing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere from an estimated 2,500 to 3,500 parts per million down to like 1,500 parts per million and kicking off a cooling trend in the climate. When the Arctic eventually opened up again, those huge blooms sank deep into the ocean, where a lack of oxygen kept them from decaying, effectively keeping all of that carbon dioxide locked up and out of the atmosphere. Azolla is still around today, and there are at least 6 known living species, and there's enough of the stuff that it's considered a weed in some places. It can be used as fertilizer, food for livestock, and has shown some promise in wastewater treatment. There's also a crowd-funded research project that's currently working on expanding our knowledge of the plant's evolution and ecology by sequencing the azolla genome. Because the question on a lot of people's minds right now is, can azolla help cool the planet again? With more research, we might just find out.
Okay, I'm glad this fern is down in the Arctic abyss, keeping carbon out of our atmosphere. But you've got to admit that it's pretty weird this freshwater fern is there in the first place. That just means that in the end, the world we know today is the weird place full of carbon dioxide. Thanks for watching this episode of SciShow. If you need something to check out next, you might like this video about what exactly the world would look like if carbon emissions heated up by 2 degrees.